All right. API description, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship OpenAPI. Its mission, to describe strange APIs, to seek out new use cases and new ideas, to boldly go where almost no one has gone before. It's not working. Yes. So good morning, everyone. Before the OpenAPI starships leave the space dock, let me introduce myself. So I'm Arnaud Lauret. I'm an architect at AXA Banque, which is a French bank and a subsidiary of the AXA Insurance Group. I work mainly on API project and API governance. I'm also known as the API handyman, the guy who wears lightsabers and funny t-shirts to share his ideas, experiences, and experiments about APIs on Twitter, blog, and conferences. I'm working on a new personal project called the API Stylebook, which is a website, apistylebook.com, in which I'm gathering and analyzing all publicly available API design guidelines to provide useful materials for API designers. So if you know about some API guidelines which is not on the API Stylebook, don't hesitate to tell me. Have you ever heard about the OpenAPI initiative or the OpenAPI specification? Good. Almost no one. And so if you don't, you probably already have seen something like that. This is Swagger UI, and it's an API documentation tool, and for many people, it's only documentation generated from the code who produce the API. For many people, it's an end in itself. And these people are making a terrible mistake. I made it myself too, because not seeing what is hiding behind Swagger UI is a terrible mistake. Swagger UI hides a gem, a treasure. Swagger UI is only the rendering of a file, an API description file, so you can describe all your API endpoints, input, outputs, and until a year ago, this API description file was called a Swagger specification. This Swagger specification is a part of the Swagger ecosystem created by someone called Tony Tam. It includes code annotation libraries, code generation tools, documentation tools. And in November 2015, the Swagger specification has been donated to the OpenAPI initiative, which is an open governance structure under the Linux Foundation with many well-known members. The OpenAPI initiative aims to create, evolve, and promote a vendor-neutral API description format, the OpenAPI specification. To make it short, the first version of the OpenAPI specification is the Swagger specification. The OpenAPI specification galaxy extends way beyond automatically generated documentation. Design, testing, code generation, tools, API governance, it's boundless. So let's leave the space dock and start to explore it. Basically, an OpenAPI specification file describes an API. This file can be created by machines, by software, and used by them, but also by humans, Klingons, Vulcans, and even Gorns. A file created by humans and used by a machine. Mr. Spock finds that fascinating. Mr. Spock is right, but is really far from the truth. This is awesome. As an API designer, have you ever struggled to find the right document, the right template, the right tool to describe your API efficiently and quickly. Have you ever feared that your API was inaccurate, incorrect, or unusable? Some people who design APIs use word processor documents, spreadsheet documents, wiki pages to describe their API. They may discover that some of their colleagues are not using exactly the same document template, as there is usually no automatic control on how these documents are structured. They are only text. They may fear that some evil devious might propose a new template, because having to manually rewrite all existing description to conform to the new template is definitely not entertaining and time-consuming. And most of all, they may discover too late that their API description contains error. They may discover too late that their API design is unusable, because when designing an API using only prose, only text, and you are going to make errors. You are going to lose time. You are going to be inefficient. And in the end, you are going to produce an API which will not match expectations and probably be a total disaster. With API description languages, such as the OpenAPI specification, it's easy to describe accurately and safely the API you are designing. The OpenAPI specification files come in two flavors, JSON and YAML. As a human API designer, you must write OpenAPI specification file using YAML. No brackets, no quotes, definitely easier to write and read. And you can convert YAML to JSON easily if necessary. By using a structured document, like the OpenAPI specification, no more fancy variations from an API description document to another, as it is a structured document, it is data. You can check that the file you are writing do not contain error, like missing parameters using the editors or command line tools. But describing an API, even in a structured document, do not help you to see if everything is really okay. You can forget some endpoints, and having awkward chaining codes, missing data between codes, and being able to play with your newly designed API without having to code anything would be great, because it can help you to see if everything is okay. You can do that with a single command line. Here I use Prism from Stoplight. You can create a mock of your API. You can then test it. Some other people can test it, and you will have really useful feedback, and it will help to improve the design of your API. And all this by just writing this simple file. But API design, even if definitely important, is not the only area of where the OpenAPI specification can be of great help. Whether it was created by humans or machines, the most well-known usage of the OpenAPI specification is still documentation. First of all, be warned that a documentation which only describes the interface constraint of an API is definitely not sufficient. An OpenAPI specification file contains many information and description about the API itself, all its endpoints, parameters, response properties, but that may not be sufficient to describe how to use it. Once that's said, an OpenAPI specification file can still be of great help to create a good part of an API documentation. You can consider it as data that you can render in many different ways. Swagger UI is one of them, but there are many more tools like Lucybot, Redoc, Swagger to Markup, and many others. And beyond this rendering, the OpenAPI specification file enable the creation of a documentation continuous delivery system where documentation becomes code. These files can be stored in a Git repository and processed by tools in a standard continuous delivery system to be transformed into something else or simply push into the API documentation portal on each commit. For many reasons, the OpenAPI specification files created during design time or produced by applications may not be suitable for a direct presentation to the people who will use it, the consumer, the developers. For example, an API can be based on multiple microservices. To his writing and reading of the file, you may have created smaller files. You may also want to produce different type of documentations, showing more or less information depending on the audience. Internal documentation showing more details than external documentation. During this continuous delivery process, the OpenAPI file can be aggregated, splitted, censored to generate new files which will be used to generate different but accurate documentation targeting different audiences. After starting to process files like that, a logical follow-up is to generate code. OpenAPI files can be used to generate SDKs, client codes, generate server in almost any programming language, but obviously there is no magic on the server side. You will have to implement the logic behind the interface. One of the area of code generation I'm particularly interested in these days is testing. When I talk about giving up generating OpenAPI files from code, some people argue that, you may end with a desynchronization between your documentation and your application. My first subjective answer is that I have not seen for now an accurate and of quality documentation generated from code. But if I am objective, and even if I prefer a design-first approach, it is still true. If someone describes an API with an OpenAPI specification file and someone else implements the application which will expose the API, we can be sure that one day there will be a divergence between the specification, the documentation, and the implementation. Fortunately, there are tools like Dread or Ready API, for example, that can help you to prevent that by generating tests that will ensure that everything is in order, and they can be included in the continuous delivery process, preventing you to push something wrong into production. Many open source and commercial tools support OpenAPI files. These tools can cover many different areas in the API universe. Design with Stoplight, Swagger Hub, Swagger Editor, RESTlet Studios, testing with tools like Postman, Po, Ready API or Dread, monitoring and run scope, documentation with LossiBot Console, RDoc, Redux, Stoplight, Swagger Hub, code generation with API-matic, Swagger Inflector, Swagger Codegen, backend as a service with RESTlet Spark, API gateways with Freescale, APG, Tech, Amazon Web Services. I'm not endorsed by all these people. So many software. Beyond the fact that it's really easy to write and parse OpenAPI files, what is really interesting is that you can extend the specification. You can add your own custom information almost anywhere in the document. All you have to do is to prefix your custom data structure with an X dash, like here with X UNS code 123. And some and maybe many of the tools I mentioned earlier can generate files including custom information. For example, The AWS API Gateway proposed to import an OpenAPI specification file to configure the API Gateway. And this is definitely a good idea because the UI to configure the Amazon API Gateway is really not easy to use. So you gain time when you do that. After that, you can link your API to your Lambda function if you do Lambda function. And in the end, you can export a new OpenAPI file, which will contain your API design, but also contain AWS extension describing the configuration of each endpoint. You can then export it, save it in your Git repository, and reuse it to create new environments. You can even modify it. And by the way, don't be fooled by sometimes in some documentation we'll see the name vendor extensions. Don't be stressed by that. Anyone can create its own extension of the OpenAPI specification. For example, at AXA Banque, we have created our own ones. One of them allows us to handle, we have some properties who have a defined set of value. And all these values are defined in a central dictionary. And we wanted to have this value in our documentation. And so we wanted to avoid to have people to copy-paste this value. So we only say, oh, this property is dictionary something. And during the building of the documentation, we retrieve the information from our central dictionary, and we inject it in the documentation. So by doing that, we have only one source of truth that can be used anywhere. Given that the OpenAPI specification is simple, easy to parse, extensible, the possibilities are endless. Every now and then, new ideas arise by being confronting to problems, by discussing with other people. Don't hang too much with other people, especially at APIdays, because you may hang with too much ideas. And I'm sure that the OpenAPI specification can help us in many different ways. Well, to be frank, what follows is a selfish call to action. I need tools, and I haven't time to create them all, so please help me. API design and governance is a hot topic, and I think we need more tools in this area. At last APIdays in Paris, we had a great discussion with Guillaume Laforge from Westlet at that time, now he's from Google, and Jason Harmon, he was at PayPal, now he's at Typeform, about how to ensure that there is a certain consistency in API design, how to ensure that people don't try fancy things. Jason told us he was working on some kind of tool that can check if a design conforms to rules. He called that the Swagger API check style. This is a great idea. After thinking, I think about it, and maybe too much. And now I want more. My dream would be to have a tool or some tools that allow you to define rules to check first. The OpenAPI file quality, just like you do codes, even if the file is structured, you can write it in many different ways. And so we need to enforce the way how people write it. A second idea would be to really enforce API design. URL structure, using of names or plural for collections, forbidden the use of verbs, check that HTTP status conform to certain rules. And another thing what I want to have is something that checks the documentation quality that's inside the OpenAPI specification, because you can have some description of operation and properties, and I dream of something that checks that the patterns of description are correct, that the good vocabulary is used. When evolving an API providers should focus on one thing: avoid breaking change. A breaking change can simply be detected by comparing the old OpenAPI specification file to the new one. And having this control in design tool, in continuous delivery tools, or things like API gateway, for example, it would be great and avoid many problems in production. When you design an API or you create API guidelines, it's really useful to see what others do. Having an easily browsable database of API specification could be of great help. There are already 2 good repositories of OpenAPI specification file. The first one is the API Stack, managed by Kinlan, the API Evangelist, and the other one is API's Guru. These are really repository with raw files with metadata. If you are looking for a specific thing, you have to dig in all the files to find what you want. And I would like to have a really easy way to search in all these files. I'm working on it. I hope to add something like that on the API stylebook. And as said earlier by Eric from the API Academy, I think that this sort of repository can help people in large organizations to see how the organization manage API and to recreate what works earlier. And finally, security and testing. I would love to have in test environments some kind of magic proxy who checks that every request and response conform to the specification and create an issue if there's something wrong. I think that could be also used in production with some kind of firewalls. I think that people who have worked with WSDL and SOAP know this. Design, documentation, code generation, testing, security, governance. The OpenAPI specification can be used in every aspect of the API universe, of the API lifecycle. So, to the people who design API, document them, code, test them, I encourage you to use the OpenAPI specification. It will make your life really easier. To the people who run API programs, who provide APIs, I encourage you to promote the use of the OpenAPI specification in your different teams. It will be a key factor of your success. To people who create API tooling, I encourage you to extensively use the OpenAPI specification. There's many things to do, many products to provide. Your millions of future customers will thank you for that. And to the people who have ideas about how to evolve the OpenAPI, I encourage you to join your community on the GitHub repository of the OpenAPI specification. Thank you very much for your attention, and don't hesitate to come to me if you have questions.
Thank you. Merci, Arnaud. Questions? Do you have questions in the audience for Arnaud? Any question? No?
No? Even about Star Trek?
I'm Mark Boyd with the APIdays team. So with the OpenAPI in specification and that sort of thing, there's some new tools that even abstract that away so that you don't need to be so involved with that. And then you can still create it, but it will create something that's in that specification format, if you like. Are you seeing, what is your take on those sorts of tools? And then are they useful for when, see, because an API is sort of like, it's something that's trying to create a business and technology being able to speak together. So then sometimes even just the specification can get a bit too technical when you're trying to, so how, so are those sorts of abstraction tools useful for maintaining the specification but also enabling a better conversation between?
Yes, as long as these tools generate OpenAPI specification or other format, it's okay because it makes API design more easy for everyone. But behind the scene, we need these tools so all programs can talk together the same language. But not everybody have to know all the details of the spec. We are here to design API, not to know tools. So it's okay. It's important.
Cool. Thank you. Any other question? Oh, yeah.
Last year, JSON was the language which was promoted, and now it's YAML. With banks needing to come up with an open banking standard and an open banking standard language. What are your takes on that? How should we do that for you with this kind of speed of new languages coming up?
Oh, so you mean about what the language, the data of the API? Yes. I promote YAML for human beings because it's really easy to write, because with JSON you have all those quotes and brackets, so it's complicated. But for the API for machines, JSON for me is still good. But if people want to do API you produce YAML, they can. But I think that JSON is more fitted for machines.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arnaud. Thank you.